So let's discuss with a couple of experts on authoritarianism. Yale University history professor Timothy Snyder. He is the author of a new book on freedom, also the author of On Tyranny. And NYU history professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She is the author of Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. It's always great to talk with both of you, our wealths of knowledge on this issue. Timothy, you've been sounding the alarm on Trump and fascism for years now. So what's your reaction to this now entering the discourse just a couple of weeks before the election and a sitting vice president now calling Trump a fascist?
Well, I think more important than who said it first or why is just the basic reality that it would be very bad if someone who is a fascist were elected president of the United States. It's sobering to think that someone who is against the basic norms of the rule of law could be ruling this country. And what hits me more than the timing, which I think is unfortunate, it's way too late, is another kind of timing that if we go this way, if we allow this person to come back to power, it's going to be the children and the grandchildren who are going to be asking, why did we do this thing? That's the timing issue, which has got me by the throat. I assume that the Democrats have reasons why they're talking about it now. That's not my job. But as a historian, what strikes me is that we're on the cusp of a decision which is going to matter for decades to come.
And it is the gravity of this issue, which is why we're having this broader discussion today. Ruth, we are now hearing from a handful of Trump's top former military insiders raising the alarm bells. The vice president described it as a 911 call to the country. But when the word fascism is evoked, there's this instinct to say it's alarmist or an exaggeration or what some call Trump derangement syndrome. What do you say to that?
I think it's really important that these leaders, and especially these generals who do not often speak out on political issues, and you could see that General Kelly was choosing his words carefully, but we have to listen to why they're saying this at this time. They believe there's a grave emergency, and there's enough evidence. That's why Trump is in my book, Strongmen. There's enough evidence that Trump has no interest in democracy. He imitates and praises dictators only, and he would like to, impose an authoritarian model of governance on America, which includes politicizing the military, having the military, become loyal to him and thus lose its professionalism, and consider anyone who's not for him as an enemy of the state, an enemy of the people. And so what we know from fascism is that they may start by targeting one group, but many other groups are targeted. When the Nazis built Dachau in 1933 as a camp because they were running out of space in their prisons, they didn't put Jews in there first. They put the political opposition, liberals, leftists, then Jehovah's Witnesses and LGBTQ people, and after that, Jews. So this is why it's very important. Every American should not think that they won't be touched by this, because they will be touched by this.
I want to highlight just some of the disturbing things Trump has said, much of it in just the last few weeks. He said January 6th was a day of love. He called Democrats the enemy within. He said political opponents could be handled by the military. He threatened to strip CBS and ABC of their broadcast licenses. He has suggested one violent day would end petty theft. And speaking of undocumented immigrants, he said, quote, getting them out will be a bloody story. Again, that's just some of what we've heard. Timothy, what's the goal of this type of rhetoric? Is it meant to instill fear, loyalty, have a chilling effect?
It's a suggestion of a completely different kind of system, as Ruth is saying. It's not that Trump is some kind of failed Democrat or that he has personality weaknesses. It's that he's describing a completely different kind of political order to which we could all be exposed and under which we could all have to live. I mean, fascism, I try to define fascism as might over right, conspiracy over reality, fiction over fact, pain over law, blood over love, doom over hope. What Trump is proposing is a politics of us against them, where the government doesn't do anything except instill in us the idea that we have enemies inside our own people, and in which we then learn to substitute expecting good things from government. We get rid of that, and instead we replace it with being provoked, with denouncing other people in our country. So, but the most disturbing thing for me, I have to say, among all those quotations, all the things he said, is the Hitler's general bit, because Trump understands things about fascism, whether we choose to use the word or not. He understands that when Hitler was able to take an oath of personal loyalty from his generals and officers, that changed the entire system. It meant that the people with the guns were no longer under the rule of law, which meant that nobody was under the rule of law. And it was at that moment when the generals swore an oath directly to Hitler rather than to the Constitution, that Hitler became the Führer, that he became this person above law, above government, who could do whatever he wanted. When Trump says he wants Hitler's generals, we have to remember it's Trump making comparison between himself and Hitler, with Hitler being positive, and it's Trump describing a different kind of order, an order in which there wouldn't be law for anyone, and in which crimes would not be punishable so long as they were a result of an order by the president. So in this rhetoric, Trump is not trying to scare us. He's not trying to, I mean, the fundamental thing that he's doing is he's describing the way that politics can look. And we have to give the man credit. He understands how fascism works, and he's describing it for us and giving us a choice. And that's why this moment, as Ruth says, is such a serious one.
Ruth, NPR poured through Trump's public remarks since 2022, and they found that he made more than 100 threats to punish or to prosecute his opponents. I mean, you often hear from his supporters and his allies. They argue, oh, he doesn't mean it. You can't take him literally. He won't actually do these things. That's what we hear from his supporters. Your response?
So in doing a book that goes over 100 years, you see certain patterns. And one pattern is sadly that every time a nation is confronted with this kind of threat, they have the "it can't happen here" thing. If you take Germany in the early 30s, it was one of the most advanced nations in the world for technology, medicine, science, engineering, graphic design, and Hitler seemed like some kind of lunatic. And even where there's a coup, like in Chile, another case study I have, and the change is instant and bloody. There were people like the conservative elites, Christian Democrats, who thought that Pinochet would establish order and then return government to the civilians. So we've always had this idea, and it's particularly marked in America, which has been a place so many millions of people have fled dictatorships to come to America as a place of freedom, as a place of a multiracial democracy where they could find a home and make the best of themselves. So we're particularly vulnerable to this. And so that's why, you know, Tim and I and others are trying to sound the alarm that it can happen anywhere. It always is a little different, but as Tim says, what is being unfolded by Trump himself is an authoritarian playbook that would draw on the tragedies and the repression of the past.
Tim, on the comments that Trump keeps repeating about the enemy within, he's been asked about it time and again in the last week and a half or so, and he is doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on it, not trying to clarify. So he means what he says. NBC spoke to some of his supporters in Arizona this past week, and they took that line and they ran with it. Watch.
So recently, Trump has been saying in some of his rallies, he's been calling Democrats the enemy from within. Do you agree with that sort of
I do.
Why?
I think they are bound and determined to destroy our country and make us like Venezuela.
Yeah, I think it's the communists started it. But yes, I mean, it's been slowly tearing everything down. There's no morals, no values anymore.
They are now the party of suppressing people's rights under, the guise of misinformation. So, yes, Donald Trump is correct.
What is your reaction to hearing that now from these voters?
Well, again, this is, to cite Jason Stanley's book, this is how fascism works. If you can replace a political language, which is about citizens and their interests and the things we have in common and compromise and peace, with the language of enemies and us and them, then you are changing the political system. Trump, with his rhetoric, and with the way his rhetoric works, and thanks to his charisma, is able to change the way people are oriented. So no longer are we together trying to make a better government, but instead we are turned against one another. And this is the fundamental shift, and Trump is good at it, and Vance is also good at it, distracting us from what government is supposed to do, which was represent us, and transforming government instead into a source of messages about who the enemy is. We know from history that this can work. And as Ruth says, we're more vulnerable to this kind of thing when we think we're exceptional, when we think we're invulnerable. This election can go many ways. And I think we could end up in a much, much better place. But we have to be sober and realistic about what happens if it goes the wrong way, if Trump and Vance wins. They are telling us what they're going to do. We are holding ourselves back from listening. I'm struck again and again these last few days and weeks, actually, by how well Trump and Vance understand the 1920s, the 1930s, fascism, strongman politics, authoritarianism.
Early voting, whether in person or via mail-in ballot, is happening across the country in 48 states. And so far, more than 30 million people have cast their vote, including former First Lady Michelle Obama, who posted a picture holding her mail-in ballot today. Early turnout in the battleground states of Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Michigan is so high, it has broken records. So with polling basically frozen, can these early vote numbers tell us anything about where this race might be headed? Well, joining me now are two people who might be able to answer that question. Dan Pfeiffer, former senior advisor to President Obama, co-host of Pod Save America and author of the Message Box newsletter, a very productive man indeed. And Simon Rosenberg, political strategist and author of the Hopium Chronicles on Substack. It's great to have you guys here to disabuse me of notions that may not be accurate. But Dan, let me start with you first. And I would love both of you guys to weigh in on this. The early voting numbers in Nevada, in Arizona, in Georgia, Republicans are outpacing, or Republican registrants are outpacing Democratic registrants in the early vote. In North Carolina, it's effectively a tie. Now, Dan, I am told by some analysts that these are voters who are maybe going to vote anyway, so it doesn't necessarily predict anything on Election Day. But do you read anything into Republican motivation other than Trump's taboo against early voting has seemingly evaporated?
Yeah, I would not read too much into these. People have gotten a lot of elections wrong trying to read, particularly to read into the early vote very early in the process. What we are seeing is that Republicans are now voting early. From talking to folks in the campaign, what they're telling me is these are primarily people who are going to vote on Election Day anyway. So what we're not yet seeing is some evidence that a bunch of low propensity, less likely Republican voters are turning out as part of the early vote. It's just how people vote is changing in this country, which is why turnout is so high. And I think the Democrats are doing well. We have to learn more about the makeup of these voters over time. But don't read too much into it. Don't celebrate. Don't panic. It's kind of a black box for most people.
A black box, Simon, is not a great place. I don't know. I don't like. Who wants to be in a black box? I will say at the risk of being overly calm. No one's ever accused me of doing that. The idea that we hear that Republican registrations are higher, that they're going up, and Democratic ones are going down in certain battleground states like Pennsylvania. We're seeing the early vote is tilting more towards Republicans in certain battleground states, though not all. I'm assuming, given the fact that you're the author of the Hopium Chronicles, Simon, that you too are not reading too much into this.
Well, I think to go back to what you said at the beginning, I mean, the polling has been very steady and consistent now for 6 weeks since the debate happened. I mean, we had confirmation this week in the national polling that in the non-red wave polls, as I call it, the non-Republican polls, the independent polls, they've stayed very steady. Kamala Harris has a modest lead nationally and is in better shape in the battlegrounds. And what we all believed was going to happen now in this close, in these final few weeks, was that our ground advantage, the fact that we're putting more ads up in the air, the fact that the spectacle that they're creating every day, which you guys just talked about, is far more appealing and interesting and compelling than what the other team is doing, that we expected that we would be moving the election towards us, that we would take a close election and go out and win it. And I think in the last few days, as Dan pointed out, we're getting deeper into the early vote. So we're starting to understand a little bit more about the patterns. And Democrats have been improving in all 7 battleground states now for 3 days in a row, where things are getting better, marginally better, which is what we would expect given our advantages that I just discussed, the field advantages, the better media, right? Frankly, a far better and more appealing candidate as well, as Trump is ending in a messy way and not in a powerful way. So I'm very encouraged, actually, what I'm seeing in the battleground states over the last few days, because it's exactly what would happen if we're going to win, which is that things are going to get marginally better a little bit every day. And we go into election day with more momentum and more capacity, because the early vote is also a test of not just intensity, but also of organization. And Dan wrote about in his Substack that Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's running this campaign, is a field genius. And you're starting to see the impact, I think, of our stronger campaign on the ground, moving the vote towards us in the last few days in particular.
I think it bears mentioning that part of the, I'm not ever going to call it bedwetting, because I think that the stakes are way too high for anybody to be accused of wetting their bed if they're worried about this election. But some of the concern, if not the outright fear right now, is based on an influx of Republican, decidedly, explicitly Republican polls that have basically flooded the zone and maybe kind of on the margins nudging up the national polling or the polling averages. Now, I've stopped looking at polls because they seem to basically be frozen and 0.2, 0.3, negative 0.2, negative 0.3. What difference does that make, except for the narrative, Dan? And you've talked about, both of you guys have talked about this in the press and on your Substack, Dan, about what it does in terms of establishing a predicate for Trump supporters to say, our guy's about to run away with this, and anything less than a victory is a stolen election. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, look, I don't worry too much about the media narrative does for the voters we need to turn out. They're not, as Joy-Ann Reid pointed out before he came on, they're not consuming all this information. They're going to make their decisions on which candidate they like better, which candidate is going to do more for their lives. But the fundamental danger of all of these Republican polls that are flooding the zone that Simon has written about so often is that they created an impression among the Republican base that Trump was going to win. It was an easy win. And if anything other than that happens, then there must have been some sort of malfeasance. This is exactly what happened in 2020. And it becomes the thing that Trump is going to wave around on election night when the race is called for Kamala Harris to say that it was stolen and then begin the process of the big lie 2.0, the insurrection 2.0. So it's important that we push back on that, and try to win this by as much as we possibly can to make that as hard a case as possible.
When we talk about lies and disinformation, I do want to bring everybody's attention to some breaking news from the Wall Street Journal. They are reporting that Trump's surrogate, the guy literally running Trump's ground operation, his grassroots outreach, his door knocking, Elon Musk, has had secret conversations with Vladimir Putin, numerous ones since 2022, the end, I believe, of 2022. Simon, President Obama spent a lot of time talking about the danger that Trump poses in a second term. Kamala Harris talked about it as well tonight. We now have John Kelly out there, his former chief of staff, his defense secretaries saying he would be a fascist in a second term. We now have reporting that the guy that is one of his close advisors, in many ways funding a lot of the Trump campaign, is in touch with America's greatest geopolitical adversary. Do you have a reaction to that? And do you have any sense of whether that's going to move anyone?
Well, I want to say one thing about what Dan said, is that, remember, they wouldn't be dropping more than 80 polls, 31 different organizations, if they thought they were winning the election, right? This is really important to understand, that they're trying to shape the media narrative because it isn't actually going in the direction that they want. And so they've had to invest in all of this. And that's just, so it's a sign of weakness and not strength on their part. On this, look, I think that the role of Elon, there was a graphic that was put out after the convention where they had the Republican, it was on the GOP Twitter feed. It was Musk, Robert Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, and Donald Trump. The five people probably most closely aligned with the Russia wing of the Republican Party, all in one Star Wars bar, graphic that they used all the time. It is amazing how many of the people that they are pushing forward have such direct ties to Russia, and that we know that Elon does, because Elon is without doubt the most important pro-Russian propagandist in American politics today. We also know that he does more business with communist China than virtually any other businessman. Very few people in the business world or Americans spend as much time with foreign hostile governments as Elon Musk does. This has always been a huge problem. And, it's actually really important, I think, that this comes out, because the idea that Elon has been pumping out this unbelievably rancid pro-Russian propaganda for the last 6 months, 9 months, 12 months without any kind of penalty for him is been not okay. I mean, the influence that the Republican Party, the way that the Russians have penetrated the Republican Party is a major issue, and I'm glad it's coming out right before the election.
Well, we're going to have more on that as we get more details. Dan Pfeiffer, Simon Rosenberg, thank you guys so much for helping me navigate this uncertain time. I appreciate your patience and wisdom.
Thank you so much, Alex.
The crucial state of Georgia, of course, which Joe Biden won in 2020 in a sort of shocking turn of events, the site of some of the most contested, hard-fought and fascinating elections of our time. Stacey Abrams, she knows. She knows all about it. She's been working to get out the vote all across Georgia, not just in the election for a while. She's, of course, the founder of the New Georgia Project and the founder of the Voter Mobilization Initiative Fair Fight Action. She's the host of Crooked Media's Assembly Required podcast, and she joins me now. Good to have you on, Stacey.
Thank you for having me.
How are things looking in Georgia to you, someone who, I don't know if there's a person in America who knows the politics of that state any better?
Well, we're very excited about where we are. As of today, a third of Georgia's voters have cast their ballots. And we know that right now it's neck and neck, which means we have to keep showing up. We've got to keep voting. But we also have to remember to reach out to our friends and our families who aren't sure, if not between voting for Vice President Harris and former President Trump, but whether they should vote or not. And this speech, this moment, is the reminder of why the affirmative of voting is so important, because it's not simply about who you like, it's about what they will do for you. And what Kamala Harris laid out means so much in the state of Georgia, a state where we have the sandwich generation taking care of kids and of parents, where we do not have Medicaid expansion, and so healthcare costs are so high, a state where we lost Amber Thurman and Candy Miller because of the arcane, horrific, and mean-spirited abortion ban that is killing women across this country, including right here in Georgia. And so this is no longer a hypothetical. This is not a contrast between two narrowly divided issues. This is a stark decision between someone who wants us to move forward and someone who only wants to exact revenge. Donald Trump does not care about Georgia. Kamala Harris does, and we need to get out and vote, and we believe we can get it done.
The Vice President speaking Amber Thurman's name today on stage, paying tribute to her, a woman who passed away after seeking reproductive care denied to her by the state's legal apparatus. In terms of the early vote, let's just take a look here. And I don't want to get too into like the weeds here, but in 2020, a huge percentage of the voters voted early. The vast bulk of Georgia voters voted early. Of course, that was in the midst of the pandemic. And this is what we have as of now. In terms of, I guess, is this today's data? So enormous levels of voting happening. Are those numbers right? Can those numbers be right? Walk us through what's happening and the difference between now and 2020.
So in Georgia, we have roughly 7.5 million registered voters, depending on the numbers you look at. In 2020, we had roughly 5.2 million people who actually voted. And so what you're looking at is one of the highest levels of early voting. And it's for two reasons. One is that despite SB 202 and Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger attempt to limit access to voting by making it harder to vote by mail, those voters who were told it's harder now to vote by mail did not give up as they were hoping. They instead have shifted to show up in person. And luckily in Georgia, we have both in-person early voting and vote by mail. But let's not get confused. This is not because they've made it easier. It's because people refuse to let them take away the right to vote. In addition, what we are seeing, though, are Republicans who used to vote on Election Day, because Republicans finally realized that if you tell everyone to wait, they may believe you. And so Republicans have made a concerted effort to shift voters into early voting. Our mission then is to make certain that we outnumber them at the polls, that we not succumb to their attempts to block us. Luckily, the Georgia Supreme Court has said that they will not suborn the new terrible chaos-laden rules that the state election board that Republicans try to put in place. And we have to think about this every day, that we have the chance to once again be the state that delivers 16 electoral college votes to Kamala Harris and to a future that we all deserve.
Yeah, that was a useful explanation of what's going on with the early voting. One of the things that is making any kind of analysis of these early votes apples to apples impossible are those two things, right? You had the pandemic in 2020, which totally changed the landscape. And now you had this weird polarization happening around voting method driven by Donald Trump's delusional fantasies and lies. And now you have more and more people voting early, not in some ideologically sorted way, which of course never made any sense to begin with. I want to end on that question you were saying before. There's been so much attention, I would say, the last 2 or 4 weeks of the last undecided voters, people who are still making up their mind. And I think you're probably right that category has diminished to a point where it's not that statistically significant. And probably a larger bucket of voters are voters that would vote, but maybe something else is going to come up. What do you think is the most important thing for turning folks that might vote but may not into absolute sure voters?
So on our podcast this week on Assembly Required, we had Kavitha Surana, who wrote the story of Amber Thurman for ProPublica. And she pointed out that this election is not just about, it is absolutely about Kamala Harris, but it's also about the judges. It's about the DAs. It's about who is interpreting these horrific laws and who can change the rules. The title that we've given this episode is Voting Can Save Women's Lives. And that, I think, is one of the most salient moments in her speech and in the decision-making of voters across Georgia and across the country. Do you want to save the lives of half of our population? Do you want women to be first-class citizens again in Georgia and around the country? Do you want to be able to take care of your family? And do you want the ability to choose what that family looks like? Those are the questions on people's minds, and that's the question that we're asking every Georgian to take into consideration and show up at the polls. The last day of early voting is November 1st. Election day is November 5th. And between now and then, go to iwillvote.com to find out where you can vote, how you can vote, and please, by God, go vote.
I try to be a humble guy. I think the presidency is, of course, such a big job. I feel extremely confident. I mean, hell, Donald Trump is healthier than I am. So I feel extremely confident that Donald Trump is going to serve and serve well for 4 years for the American people. And I'm going to help him, and we're going to make America great again, and we're going to do it together.
That was Republican Senator J.D. Vance speaking at a rally in Reno, Nevada yesterday. Joining us now, contributor to the conservative website The Bulwark, Tim Miller. He previously served as communications director for Jeb Bush and spokesman for the Republican National Committee. He's one of our favorites around here. Tim, J.D. Vance is almost 40 years younger than Donald Trump, but that won't stop him from saying that Donald Trump is healthier, smarter, more handsome than he is. There really isn't anything they won't say to flatter the boss, will they?
Yeah, I mean, the North Korea type spin remains uncomfortable, even though we've been dealing with it for whatever 9 years now, Jonathan. And I think J.D. Vance in particular feels like he has to go overboard to overcompensate for the fact that he sounded a lot like me. He was a never Trump Republican for many years before he decided to go all in. And I think this is kind of a way for him to maintain credibility with the boss. And that has an audience of one, if you will.
Yeah, no doubt there. So let's talk about Kamala Harris. What appears to be part of her closing argument is these John Kelly revelations, and it fits into her declaration that Donald Trump is unfit for office, in terms of how he praised Hitler and the like. Do you think that's an effective argument here? And who would it work with?
Yeah, I don't know that the Hitler part itself is that effective of an argument, right? I mean, any person who thinks that Donald Trump might be Hitler curious is already voting against him, or maybe there's another category of people that like that, but those people aren't really gettable either. And so, but I think that there is an element of this that's really important, and all the testing shows this, right? Which is, if you think about the types of voters that are available, it's mostly kind of my people, like Mitt Romney voting older Republicans that are trying to decide if they can get there on Kamala, that don't like Trump, the Nikki Haley voter, if you will. or younger people who haven't really paid that close of attention to what's happening and might not know who John Kelly is still. Like those are the two of the kind of final groups that haven't decided where they're landing. And I think communicating to them that the closest people around Donald Trump, that maybe if you're wavering, listen to Mike Pence, listen to John Kelly, listen to Jim Mattis. His closest advisors can't get there. They think that he's dangerous. They think he's not worth the risk. I think that more nuanced message is quite compelling. And it tests well if you look at Democratic internal polling as well.
So voters that might still be available, you just mentioned a few. There's also this, we've had a few cycles in a row now where there's been sort of a hidden vote. 16 and 20, the Trump supporters were undercounted by pollsters. They showed up bigger on Election Day, enough to give them a win in 16 and a much closer loss than expected in 20. What group do you think could be that hidden vote this time around? Are there still more Trump voters that pollsters aren't picking up? Or is it someone else, perhaps women who were upset by the Dobbs decision who might be breaking late and quietly for Harris?
Yeah, we'll stay with the positive first, and she ended there. I do think that non-college white women post-Dobbs, we haven't seen a lot of this. You saw a little bit of this in the midterms in places like Kansas, where an abortion referendum did well in a very conservative state. I think that there's some non-college white women out there that live in very Trumpy communities, whose husbands are for Trump, whose neighbors have huge Trump signs, that aren't really talking about the fact that they plan to vote for Kamala Harris. I think that's out there. How big is it impacting polling? Who's to say? I think the worry, if you're Harris, is that this other group, kind of younger Black and Latino men, maybe aren't being responsive to polls, and you're seeing some evidence that there's some slippage there. And so I think we'll know. I was listening to Amy Walter of the Cook Report. You'll know a lot early on Election Day, based on those upper Midwest states. If she's overperforming there, it might have been those non-college white women or older Republican voters. If Trump's doing better in kind of the, let's say, the Mountain West states, it might have been those younger Hispanic men.
So, Tim, as a final question, give us your take on the map right now. What is Harris's best path? Is it still the 3 blue wall states, or do you think it's a mix and match with some Sun Belt?
I think it's the 3 blue wall states, and then if you lose one, you're looking at either North Carolina could replace Wisconsin and Michigan, or North Carolina plus Nevada could replace Pennsylvania. And I think those 5 states are pretty much the ones that matter the most. Georgia and Arizona, I don't think are out of reach for her, but I think those are they're less important as far as reaching 270. And I think Donald Trump's in the best position in those 2 of the 7 states.
Yeah, certainly those in the Harris campaign of the 7 battleground states probably feel the worst about Arizona, but growing more confident about Nevada. So that could fit into that puzzle piece you just described. Contributor to the conservative website, The Bulwark, Tim Miller. Tim, thank you as always. We'll talk to you again real soon.
The aftershocks of the release of the Kelly tapes, a retired 4-star general, a life of sacrifice and service, a Gold Star father, a former chief of staff to Donald Trump, going on the record and on tape, importantly, saying that Donald Trump, in his view, meets the technical and practical definition of a fascist. General Kelly also recounting the numerous times he mentioned his admiration for Hitler and Hitler's generals to John Kelly. Today, the question everyone has to grapple with, what would it mean to have someone like that as our commander-in-chief? And what would it mean, more importantly, for those serving in the United States military? And how could a Hitler-admiring fascist, in the words of John Kelly, not somehow erase the significance of the sacrifices made to save the world from Hitler and fascism during World War II? Here's how past American presidents of both parties talk about Hitler and the fight against fascism.
We are determined, with our noble allies here, that Europe's freedom will never again be endangered. We now have about 200,000 Americans, fighting men in Europe, to make sure that this threat is never before us again.
You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for, because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man.
The most difficult days of your lives brought us
50 years of freedom. You did your job. Now we must do ours. Let us begin by teaching our young people about the villainy that started this war and the valor that ended it.
It is a strange turn of history that called on young men from the prairie towns and city streets of America to cross an ocean and throw back the marching mechanized evils of fascism. And those young men did it. You did it.
Freedom is worth it. Democracy is worth it. America is worth it. The world is worth it. Then, now, and always.
And here's how Donald Trump views fascism and Hitler, in the words of someone who served his country in uniform for decades and also served as the longest chief of staff to Donald Trump.
He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good. Looking at the definition of fascism, it's a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks will work better in terms of running America. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
That's where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Tim Miller's here. He's the host of the Bulwark podcast and former RNC spokesman. Also joining us, retired four-star general, MSNBC military analyst Barry McCaffrey's here. Democratic strategist and president of Brilliant Corners Research, Cornell Belcher's back. And with me at the table for the hour, the host of the Fast Politics podcast and special correspondent for Vanity Fair, Molly Jong-Fast is here. General McCaffrey, I start with you. It's not just that Trump is now described as a fascist by three of the most senior generals who've ever served the country and certainly who've ever been a part of the modern political conversation because of the choices they made to serve, in John Kelly's case, as chief of staff, and Secretary Mattis's case as Secretary of Defense. But by all three of them describing Donald Trump as a fascist, Generals Milley and Mattis to author Bob Woodward, and John Kelly in his own words to Mike Schmidt of the New York Times, the country has to grapple with what that means, not just in 14 days, but about our history. We are a country that describes and agrees that the greatest generation is the generation that fought fascism, is the generation that fought Hitler, who Donald Trump says, quote, did a lot of good things too. How do we do that?
It's very difficult to address this issue rationally. It's so preposterous. Hitler and his generals murdered 21 million people, the mentally ill, the gypsy population, 6 million Jews. They killed the sick, the elderly, the prisoners of war. They devastated Europe from the Ural Mountains all the way to the English Channel. We had 400,000 plus U.S. troops killed during that conflict. My dad served, all three of my uncles. The nation came together. We put 16 million men and women into uniform to try and roll back this evil. It's simply beyond belief that Trump could take this stance. And by the way, Kelly, I've known for decades. He's one of the finest public servants, Marine generals we've ever produced. Man of rock-like integrity. Trump then responds to him that he's a lowlife and a degenerate. Who talks like that? This guy is a basic threat to the security of the United States and to our Constitution.
General McCaffrey, how do you convey how un-American it is to believe that Hitler did good things when so many American families' proudest legacy is what you just described, that someone in their family, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, served in World War II to fight Hitler and fascism?
Well, that's right. And, you know, Hitler did have the loyalty of generals, and they marched right over the cliff together. The worst impact on Germany from Hitler was the devastation of their own country. By the end of the war, it was a rubble pile. 1 out of 2 German homes was destroyed. He devastated his own people. I don't think you can address this coming at it from a rational perspective. I think Mr. Trump, by the way, that when he lost the last election and he moved a retired lieutenant colonel out of the White House and put him in the Pentagon, at the time I was on air on NBC saying this guy is arranging a coup against the United States government. He had an acting Homeland Security, an acting Secretary of Defense. He tried to fire the CIA director. He had an acting Department of Homeland Security. He was setting up a third world coup against the Constitution. This time, he's telling us in advance he's going to eliminate the deep state. He's going to deport 25 million people using the armed forces. The language, the actions of political rhetoric is 1930s Germany. We have been told directly, we got to wake up. This is not hyperbole. This isn't entertainment value. This guy is a fundamental threat to our way of life.
Cornell, let me show you how Vice President Kamala Harris dealt with the tapes and the revelation last night at a town hall over at CNN. First, on the question of whether Trump is a fascist.
Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted. Again, look at their careers. These are not people, with the exception, I think, of only Mike Pence. These were not politicians. These are career people who have served in the highest roles in national security, who have served as generals in our military, who are highly respected. Talking about the person who would be commander-in-chief.
So is he a fascist? Is a question that must now be asked of every person, man and woman, in elected office, because it's a binary answer. Yes, and you agree with General Kelly, who's on tape saying so, Jim Mattis, and Mark Milley, who said he was fascist to the core. And it's a yes or no question that everyone serving in American government and aspiring to American politics has to now answer.
Listen, Nicole, you and I have been working in politics a long time, right? This is crazy uncharted waters, right? We can have policy discussions at the national level for candidates about taxes, but this is where we're literally having a conversation about whether or not someone who might be president of the United States is a fascist. First, I want to say, actually, I think we still owe a world of thank you to General Kelly and those other generals who are still on duty. Because I still see this as General Kelly and those other generals, they're still protecting America, right? This isn't about partisanship. They have an oath to this country and to the Constitution. And thank God for them that they still see that they're standing on duty for this country and trying to protect this country. So I'm very thankful that they came out, that General Kelly came out and he's putting this forward in a close. My question, I actually want to sort of throw the question back to you, Nicole, is how much of this conversation about fascism is going to matter to that 48% of Trump voters that we know voted for him 2 times before, right? How many of those voters are going to move or even understand what fascism is or the threat that fascism presents to their freedoms? I mean, this is uncharted waters where we're having a conversation. We've got to explain to American people, especially a lot of young people, what the threat of fascism is. and how that could impact their lives.
When a word like fascist becomes part of a major news story like a U.S. election, it is important to remember why that word is so important and the history behind it. That's why I knew I had to talk to Heather Cox Richardson, American history professor and the creator of the newsletter and podcast Letters from an American. She's also the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Democracy Awakening: Notes on the State of America. Watch this. Heather, thank you so much for joining me again. For the last few months, I've been saying we need Heather's expertise because the last time you and I spoke, you said that you did not believe Donald Trump was actually trying to win votes and that what he was just trying to do is create chaos and doubt that he would take advantage of after the votes are cast. We're now less than 2 weeks away. Has that opinion changed at all?
No, I don't think it has at all. I mean, think about the degree to which he has gone out of his way not to reach out to voters, to reject the Harris voters, for example, and really to focus on his base to see if he can get his base to turn out and cause chaos.
Fascist is a very big word, and it's a serious word. But Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, John Kelly, just used that very word to describe Trump after Trump suggested using the military on the enemy within. It was the enemy within that sort of got John Kelly. And the enemy within meant his political opponents. As a historian, how are you taking all of this?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that you are highlighting this because it's huge. And the degree to which it has been sort of brushed over today has really astonished me because it is a really, really big deal for John Kelly to have come forward and to have used that word because we understand just how closely associated it is with Hitler's Germany. And yet he went on to explain why he thought that and why he believed that Trump would, in fact, use the military against first his political enemies, because before you can go after the minority groups that are your base really wants to go after, you need to stop people from being able to push back against that. So you go after your political enemies first and go forward to create this authoritarian government. To me, it is the story of the election. We've seen it coming for a while. Kelly is not the first person to call attention to Trump's authoritarian ways. Mattis did the same thing. But it is something that people absolutely should be thinking about when they go to the polls on November 5th.
Donald Trump loves tariffs. He said tariff is his favorite word in the English language. And lately, he keeps pining for the good old days of the 1890s. And back in the 1890s, tariffs were widespread. But back then, politicians were honest. They were frank about the fact that tariffs were a tax on consumers. Donald Trump will still not admit that. Can you explain to our audience the difference between Trump's fantasy and the 1890s?
Sure. Well, you think about the 1890s, and he talks about what a wealthy period it was in the United States. But in fact, if you think about it, we had the people we now know of as the robber barons, the J.D. Rockefellers and Andrew Carnegies, who were building cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, that are these giant mansions. But at the same time, you had people working for them who had no protections. They had no government regulations for how they could be treated. They had no wage protections. They had no hour protections. Children were working in the factories. If you got mangled, for example, in a piece of machinery, you were out of work and out of luck. There was nobody who was going to come provide for you in any way. So when he's talking about this beautiful world as he sees it, he is thinking about the people who are on the very top, not the rest of us. And I think one of the things that you really need to understand when he talks about tariffs is tariffs in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, provided the money that the United States government used to do the things that it needed to do. And that changes dramatically with the Revenue Act of 1913, when the Democrats cut that tariff way back and they replace it with an income tax on high earners. So when Trump talks about having these high tariffs and pairs that with the idea of cutting taxes for the wealthy and for corporations, what he's really talking about is making sure that the actual funding of the U.S. government comes from the middle class rather than the people at the very top. And that's the exact opposite of what Vice President Kamala Harris is talking about. Again, a really different vision of the future that he wants for the country. And frankly, as a 19th century historian, I really never thought my knowledge of William McKinley was ever going to come in handy. It's not a direction that most of us think we'd like to go.
You know, it's so funny that you just mentioned the robber barons building cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, and two of the most recent purchases of those mansions, those estates in Newport have been a few years ago, Larry Ellison and then Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone, who is maybe one of Donald Trump's biggest Wall Street backers and has become one of the wealthiest men in America. So it's so funny that you would compare the two. Steve's filling that house with priceless art as we speak. I want to ask you about Elon Musk, though. Oh, sorry. Yes.
But you know this so well. I mean, what they are really talking about is a world in which a very few people have the wealth and the power and the control over the rest of us, because they really believe a few people are really better than the rest of us. And that's, I think, one of the things that dovetails so effectively with fascism. That's a very similar ideology to fascism. So it's not an accident that the same people who built the cottages in Newport are being emulated now by the people now who are saying basically the same thing.
Then let me just ask you, are there any historical comparisons for the role Elon Musk has taken in this election?
Well, Elon Musk, I have to say, with his lottery and his moves on the stage there, is a unique individual for sure. That being said, you cannot look away from two things with Musk. One, that he is trying to buy an election, which again is very late 19th century. It was actually the election of 1890 that gives us modern campaign financing, when in fact, out of fear that ordinary people would elect a Democrat and get rid of the tariff, the John Wanamaker, who went on to be famous as the person who got the department store going, was the first financier of the Republican Party. And he simply went around to all his rich friends and said, please cough up the dough so we can put our guy in office. So there's partly buying the election. There is also, I think, something significant about Musk jumping in now. And that is that you cannot look away from the fact the Republican Party is in the middle of a civil war. Nobody quite knows who is going to take the mantle of Trump. And with the realization that J.D. Vance is now stepping in there, Trump is not mentally healthy. It looks like he's not going to be able to fulfill a full term. J.D. Vance is the obvious heir apparent. And now there seems to be a struggle going on over who is going to be the person behind J.D. Vance. And that, I think, the fact that Musk jumped in as he did, at the end as sort of a savior, says he would like very much to be part of that succession.